Imagine this. You're taking a stroll through a small, picturesque village. The sun is shining. The air smells like fresh herbs and sea breeze. An elderly woman who looks about 70 effortlessly overtakes you on a hill, waving with a smile. Turns out she's actually 95, and she's heading to her garden to pick vegetables for dinner. Welcome to a blue zone where people regularly live to be 100 years old and still have the energy to school you in a brisk walk. Let's dive in. In this episode, we are going to be unlocking the secrets of the world's longest lived people. We're going to learn some things from a blue zone. We're going to learn some things from a recent seminar that Joelle was at. And we're going to take you guys on this very intriguing journey with us. But to start off, Joelle, why don't you talk to us a little bit about where you were last night and what it was all about?
Yeah, so I was invited to an event last night with a researcher from UC Santa Barbara who specifically does research on aging and longevity. And so he works with this aging and longevity center. And it was very, very interesting overall to see some of which we already know in terms of aging and longevity, but what a lot of the new research is alluding to. And he specifically was very excited to talk about how much he believes that it is fully in our realm and in the realm of possibility that immortality is a possibility, which was a very interesting take. And two, he said that the first person who is going to live to 150 years old is alive today. And that was very interesting as well. And really makes
Is
you
his name
think
Brian
about,
Johnson?
yeah. His name was Dr. Joel Rothman. You
No,
can
I
look
meant
him
the
up
guy who's going to live to be 150. Have you followed Brian Johnson at all? He's a
no,
dude who will
isn't Brian Johnson the liver king?
there are a
Isn't that
lot of
his
Brian
name?
Johnsons apparently, but
There
this
probably
this is
are.
the Brian Johnson who he just blew up this year. I feel like he was the one of the original PayPal founders, and he spends millions of dollars on research. Like he's got a lab in his house doing all this crazy stuff. He
Hmm,
travels for gene therapy. He does like all kinds of actual studies directly on himself, measuring this, has doctors measuring
interesting.
things. So I would check him out. But this is the guy who I believe wants to live to be 200. His objective is don't die. Maybe it's not 200, but this is the guy who's going to be 150 years old.
No, you know who I think is going to be the person?
Our
Sloan.
kids, our
Sloan.
kids, specifically
Just
Sloan.
Sloan.
Just Sloan.
Lonely life if they're not all going with her.
It was very interesting. He talked about that his granddaughter is like 2.5 years old. And he was like, I think it's her generation that's going to live to 150, 180, 200 years old. So that was very, very interesting. Originally he popped up on the screen like, hey, these are the things that we know currently do contribute to anti-aging and longevity. And so much of that, are things that we talk about, and specifically, if we go like L5 method route of mindset, movement. Sorry, I'm not saying them in order, Josh, but exercise, training, nutrition, mindset, movement, habits. We know that a big part of that in and of itself is what helps contribute to longevity and overall health. And so, the things that he brought up for effective interventions in the what he was calling the aging clock was exercise, diet, calorie restriction, which I have a lot of questions about that specific research, but blue zone lifestyle and sleep. And so these are obviously things that all of us talk about, on the podcast, on social, everywhere. And so these are not new to us, but what was very interesting was the research that he shared over like the last, I would say most of what he was sharing was like 2019 to current, which is a lot of research in the last 5 years or so that's really starting to take off in terms of clinical trials and what they're looking at in animals that will potentially translate to humans.
Yeah, I think this stuff is so interesting. And, you brought up the L5 method, training, nutrition, mindset, movement, habits. These are the basics, the fundamentals of living a healthy lifestyle. My belief is that gets you to 70, 80, maybe 90, in regards to a health span, a long, happy, healthy life. And then as technology continues to evolve, as AI comes out, as we develop treatments for certain things, we catch things earlier and we keep our bodies thriving from a cellular level. We could figure out what improves those things. That's what gets us from 70, 80, 90 to 100, 110, 120. This guy's saying 150. And it doesn't seem like it should be that far out. For as far as we have come technologically, we know so much, but we also know that we continue to deteriorate when it comes to health, especially in this country. And that's just lifestyle. So mastering those first and then taking all these fun things you put on top, the sky should be the limit.
I was just going to say, I think it's really awesome that he focused on these basic things because you see, like, longevity is trendy right now, right? Like, you look on social media and you see all of the flashier things like the red light therapy and the cold plunges. And, we've talked about some of this stuff before. And it's not that those things are inherently harmful or things that you shouldn't be doing, but that's what gets people's attention when it comes to longevity and aging and all of that. But we know that these basics are going to make a significantly more bigger impact than those little things that may help in some areas.
It comes back to just social media in general. It's,
Right.
You're going to do the thing that's sexy, that's most interesting. It's, shiny object syndrome, moving your body throughout the day, eating healthy, working out. Those things aren't sexy. Those are the things you're supposed to be doing. But if I can take this magic pill and I'm supposed to live to be 150, well, that's exciting. I'm going to go spend $1,000 a month on that thing.
But I was just saying, I think it's really cool to have this person come in and talk to this large group of people and is focusing on those basic things. Like that's just refreshing in my opinion.
It was. And I'm going to admit, I went into this thing very skeptical. Like Brant had to give me a warning. This was an event that my husband's financial firm basically put on to invite clients to. And they actually found him. This is what's really interesting. They found this researcher from a previous talk, I think that he did with another financial firm, because he goes to financial firms and investment firms and things like that to explain that, hey, the retirement plans that you are creating for people, if you're banking on people retiring at 85 and that's how you're building their financial plans, but humans in these next generations are going to live to 150 years old, you're going to have to change the way you advise financial planning. So that's how a longevity guy ended up at a financial firm, and that's how I ended up there. So
what
Brant
a niche.
was like, "You
Good
have
for
to come."
him.
Yeah, what a niche, right? So that's how I ended up there. And Brant was like, "You have to come to this. It's like, this is so up your alley. It's longevity and health." And I went in so skeptical. I was like, if this man starts with all his quackery and but he was actually just really, really knowledgeable. And there's a few different, things that I would look for personally in listening to a researcher. Like, this was not, a dentist, a doctor dentist who was now like preaching research on longevity. This was a PhD, who has his background and his degree and years and years and years and years in molecular biology and longevity and aging research studies. And he's, working with students on doing this research and has these worms in his lab and they're changing their genes to, like, he's doing this. So that was okay, I think this guy's onto something. And I don't think he's a
offense to all the dentists out there.
Sorry to any dentists listening. For me, it's just like a scope of practice thing. Half the people yelling like in stores about grocery items shirtless have no business even having any sort of whatever topic for another time. So all of this to say, when he was going into this, Brant was like, "I need you to keep an open mind, go into this with an open mind, ask questions if you would like, but also settle down. I just know you, settle down." And so overall, it was really interesting. And, a lot of what he's talking about is sort of theoretical. There's a lot of like, well, this worked in worms when we tested and this worked on mice. And you're looking at the differences and you're looking at the research. He had a big PowerPoint presentation and, he's showing when we administer gene therapy on this mouse and we didn't administer gene therapy on this mouse, look at the aging differences. And there's one mouse that looks like old and decrepit and its hair is falling out. And one mouse who's like, its fur, hair, whatever, looks great. It's shiny, it's full, it's luscious, bright-eyed, looks like a healthy mouse, not that I'm very well versed on what healthy mice look like. But he's showing pictures of the differences of like, this is the one that got gene therapy, this one didn't. This is the one that got this anti-aging medication, and this is the one that didn't. And you can see the visual differences. And so, we're not doing that in humans yet. So that's the theoretical part of like, it works in mice, it's worked in other mammals. We're mammals. So in theory, maybe it should work. But mice and humans are not exactly the same. So it's cool. It was very interesting. Also, some of which you have to take with a grain of salt. And I think there were a lot of people in the audience that at the end, when they had questions about like, so what do we do now? Because none of this is currently happening yet. We're not doing this gene therapy on humans yet. We're not doing this, cell therapy on humans yet. This is in decades to come, right? And you have an audience of mostly people in their 50s, 60s, 70s who are like, so what can I do? What can I do now? And us three, right? And a lot of the people who are listening to this podcast know that it starts before you're 70. Like it starts with what you are doing: mindset, movement, habits, trading, nutrition, blah, blah, blah. It starts with what's happening earlier and what you're doing earlier. And I don't want to say like those people are doomed. But I just, every time someone had a question like that, I just wanted to like turn around to the back of the audience and be like, exercise, fiber, nutrition.
Nah, give me that
Like,
gene
that's what you
therapy
could
injection. Give
be.
me that.
I'm like, that's what you could be doing now. He did say, he's like, look, when this stuff comes about, it's only going to be the really, really wealthy at first who are going to have access to these things. He's like, and that's unfortunate, like that, but that's how this is going to roll out. It's not going to be normal for a long, 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 long time. But he did talk about how there are some instances where we are doing gene therapy. He gave an example of, someone close to him doing IVF, and the mom herself had the BRCA gene. Oh, look at that. The mom herself had the BRCA gene, which is the basically breast cancer gene mutation. And so they did IVF so they could specifically screen the embryos to see if the embryos had the BRCA gene, and then removed the embryos that did from basically the pool so that they wouldn't, give those embryos to the mom. So there are some, and I believe I'm correct on that, where they just didn't use those embryos
So that's more
versus
selection than the specific therapy, though,
versus
right?
right versus like I don't think they were able to go in and remove that gene and then use the embryos. I think they just opted to not use those embryos that had that gene mutation. But it does kind of start to make your head spin over like, if we could do that, what else could we do? And again, I don't know if it'll be in our lifetime, but I think it'll definitely be in our kids' lifetime in some capacity.
That makes me curious as far as, and I'm not super well versed, but I started to become more well versed this past year, but completely different mechanism in regards to peptides, right? So a chain of amino acids that sends a molecular signal within your body to continue to do certain things that our body starts slowing down to do. Whereas gene therapy would actually be going in to manipulate those genes. But I am curious as to why we don't lean into that a little bit. I think it's a little more common in other countries. It's starting to become more mainstream here, but it's still not. I mean, your doctor's not prescribing these things. Hey, we're dealing with, we're losing some muscle mass, or we need help with fat loss, or
Yeah.
improving insulin sensitivity outside of a pharmaceutical. If we can get our body, we can send a message within our body to do it itself again, to improve its function. So I'm a little curious as to why we kind of skip over that and jump right to gene therapy and wait years and spend exorbitant amounts of money to get that when it is readily available.
It's funny. My dad came with me to this. He was very interested in this talk too. So we went in together. And my dad's first question when we finished, when I was like, what'd you think? He's like, I would have loved to know if like where peptides play a role in this. It was your exact question pretty much, Josh. And I was like, yeah, he didn't talk about any of that. Now, there were so many things, to cover. And I know he was trying to keep it pretty like broad and not get too into the weeds of science. There were a few things that I was hoping he would talk about, like telomeres, and we could talk about that here for a minute. And so at the end, when people were asking questions, I asked a question about telomeres. And so he ended up being like, oh, great question. Like, how do you know about telomeres? And we got into it, but he was like, I have basically he had like, I don't know, call it 20 slides that he went through, right? But then when I asked him this question about telomeres, he pulled up like his whole presentation that was probably like 200 slides deep. And he's like, let me find my telomere slide for you. So I think there was just so much that he could have gone into, but he's like, I got an hour clock and I have an audience who presumably is not very like, it's not a room of health and fitness coaches.
Yep.
Right.
It's a room of like retired, older people who are likely listening, and
Just letting you know you're not
attending
going to
it.
die as soon as you think.
Yeah, but that was basically his take. And I had asked about you because he hadn't talked about telomeres at all. And I wanted to nerd out a little bit. I was like, you haven't mentioned telomeres. What is the role in all of this? Like, are you talking about with, the cell therapy and the gene therapy? Is it changing the telomere? And so, for those that don't know, the telomere is like the protective cap at the ends of chromosomes. And essentially, they get shorter and shorter with cell division. And that division and that shortening is what continues to age us. And so shorter telomeres are associated with a decreased lifespan and increased risk of age-related diseases. So then you start talking about, well, what kinds of things can increase the length of our telomeres and keep those caps long on the end of our chromosomes? Exercise, sleep, right? And so again, coming back to the habits, like what do we know works? What do we know is good for our telomeres? Exercise and sleep, and proper nutrition and, vitamins and minerals. So yeah, it was very interesting overall. And I think that there's likely a lot of possibilities. The only other thing that he did mention, which was very interesting, and I have to look into this more because I don't know a ton on it, and I would have to dig into some of the research. And I wrote down some of the papers that he cited so I could dig into them myself. But he mentioned supplementing with taurine, and he was very careful about pushing any sort of supplement because he didn't want to come across like this is the key, this is the answer to everything. And like you said in the beginning, Josh, there's so many people, right, who just want the pill and they're like, let me take the thing, right? And we know that exercise is effective for anti-aging and sleep is effective for anti-aging. We don't know for sure that this taurine is effective for anti-aging, but there's quite a few things that it seems promising for. It's an amino acid. Our bodies make it. We get it from beef and chicken and meat. But he went on to say that after all the research he has seen, he is personally supplementing with taurine every day because there's not really any adverse side effects. And the research so far to him seems promising. So do with that information as you will. I'm always quick to recommend a supplement before someone is nailing those basics, is nailing the exercise, the nutrition. And, there were, of course, people in the audience like, how much, what's the dosage? How much should we take? How often should we take it? And I couldn't help but think to myself, like, how many of you are exercising regularly before asking that question, or paying attention to how many colors you're consuming in a day before asking that question, or getting 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep every night before asking that question? So I think supplements, it's very cool if it comes out to be that like your local drugstore supplement is something that could help you with aging and longevity. But I think we just can't hammer home enough that the basics of what we talk about are going to be huge in some of those keys to longevity.
Which is why we're over here beating a dead horse with the same concepts in new
Yeah.
aspects and new, situations. So I do want to dive into some of these. And ironically enough, I did write an article, a blog last week, kind of going through blue zones, and a lot of these topics carry over. So the one I want to start with, and I know I think you said a bit skeptical. So just your thoughts on it in regards to eating in a slight caloric deficit being a potential benefit for longevity. I assume that has a bit to do with autophagy.
Yeah, so I was actually bummed that he didn't dive into that a little bit further because the five or so examples he gave of, things that were evidence-based effective strategies for longevity were sleep, exercise, nutrition, blue zone lifestyle, and calorie restriction. And he didn't get to dive into calorie restriction a whole lot, and it was the one that I had the most questions on, because he didn't specify calorie restriction in terms of like a long-term deficit, just always living in a deficit versus time restricted calorie restriction, which would be something like intermittent fasting, right? And we've heard of things like autophagy and apoptosis, where, cell death and then clearing those cells. And that does make sense. He mentioned that he did get to mention regarding the caloric restriction piece that specific research, and I'll have to find the study, but that specific research was that a 25% deficit helped with longevity. But I have so many follow-up questions to that because
Yeah, that's not insignificant.
no, first of all, that's a fairly steep deficit. And we also have to remember that when we introduce a deficit without strength training, we're also putting ourselves at risk for muscle loss. And we know that increased muscle loss or sarcopenia or muscle atrophy, or sarcopenia is really age-related muscle loss, but we know that all of those things decrease lifespan. We know that losing muscle decreases lifespan, and increases the risk of all cause mortality. And so my thought process is, if you are in a chronic deficit, you might not be getting all the nutrients you need, which is problematic in and of itself. And B, if you're losing muscle, you're also creating other health issues. So I didn't get to like go through this with him because again, he was not hyper focused on that piece. But those are what I would have follow-up questions too about, Josh. Like, was it, time restricted, intermittent fasting versus, a 25% deficit all the time? The nutrient deficiencies and muscle loss pose a big, red flag for me potentially. And the other thing is, I think it's very, very hard to know, and this will be what's hard to kind of research, I think, with human trials in longevity and aging, is that if you put someone in a deficit, right, who is overweight or obese, yes, them losing weight and getting down to a more healthy body fat percentage is going to decrease the risk of high cholesterol, decrease the risk of heart disease,
That was going to
decrease
be
the
my
risk of
take on it.
diabetes.
That was
Which
like
then,
when you first said that, that's where my mind went. Like, most of
yeah, like,
us in
well,
this country are obese or massively overweight. So it makes sense from that perspective if we can get the
right.
majority in the deficit and therefore lose body fat.
But they're not doing this on humans. This is specifically in mice, which I'm assuming are not overweight to begin with. So that's definitely
So
absolutely
that's
plays a
why,
role.
and that's why you have to see the research, because I don't know if
Yeah.
this was specifically a human study, and then what were the outcomes that they looked at that measured longevity. Like, were you actually looking at the cellular, like a cell health versus, oh, this person's risk of diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, went down because they lost weight, because they were in a deficit, and so now they're likely to live longer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
What
that's
a,
like, those are not the same things. You know what I mean?
yeah, there's a lot of crossover and like this could be that. But I think in a lot of the discussion when it comes to being in a caloric deficit, it does have to do, like, they're typically focused on autophagy. And for those who are unfamiliar, as we get older, we accumulate cellular damage, which is going to lead to all kinds of buildup and potentially cancers and diseases down the road. So autophagy, the recycling of those cells, regenerating of newer, healthier cells, helps eliminate that waste, that buildup. So overall health can be proven to be optimized. And there are different mechanisms of doing that. So strictly being in any caloric deficit will trigger autophagy. There has been debates among those who love things like fasting and intermittent fasting, and those who just are strictly on, no, you just have to be in a caloric deficit. But there's a belief that when you go into more prolonged fasting or intermittent fasting, eating within those shorter windows, that autophagy is enhanced. So that's one way to look at it. This is something that I've dabbled with just in regards to my digestive issues, trying to get reins in on that. The problem that I had, and this is kind of a benefit for most people, it was a problem for me, is in that shorter window, I was eating way less than I needed to be. Like, I maintain at around 3,000 calories a day. And after a few weeks, I'm like, why am I so tired, run down? I'm not recovering from these workouts. So I started tracking again, and I was probably around 2,400 calories. So by default, it's much easier to be in a caloric deficit when you are eating within specific windows, which is a huge plus for a lot of people. It puts,
Yeah.
better guidelines. I'm not eating from the time I wake up until right before I go to sleep and a bunch of junk in between, and I'm well over my surplus. So it's just different things to be aware of. But typically, when it comes to that deficit, that's usually the theme that they're talking about when they're, what is the impact on longer term health outside of the concept of just simply reducing body mass.
He also didn't call it for the record, and that's why I want to look into, what he was specifically citing, but he didn't call it time restricted feeding. He said calorie restriction.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm like, is he talking specifically about, intermittent fasting? But anyway, regardless, you know what else helps with autophagy? Exercise.
Take it
You
away.
wouldn't say.
Sleep.
Can we touch on the blue zone thing more? Because I think that also is starting to become a buzzword. I don't know much about it, and I'm sure there's people out there who are like blue zone. Like when you first said blue zone, I don't know why my mind went here, but I thought of like blue light filtering glasses, and I know that's not what this is. So can we clarify blue zone and what that means?
So blue zones are typically they're the main areas, the highest density of people who are living 100 years and beyond. What do they call them?
Yeah.
Centenarians, something like that.
Yes, I think centenarians.
Centenarians. So you're talking about Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, Nicoya Peninsula, Costa Rica, Icaria, Greece, Loma Linda, California. I don't know if there's a bunch more, but they're
There's
not
only
just.
five,
There's five. Is that the
five,
five?
five blue zones in the whole world.
There we go. There's the five. So it's not just, it's they're so focused on their lifestyle because they're not just living to that age, but they're healthy, they're moving, they look really good. They don't look like they're that old. So there's been a lot of interest. Like, is it the food? Like, what is the lifestyle? And it's a culmination of all those things. And it's just the way they live. So we can kind of circle back to these, but some of the top things they're doing, they're moving. They're not necessarily going to the gym all the time, although that's obviously a big benefit with strength training, but they're moving throughout the day. They're eating real whole foods, mostly plants. They're not consuming a ton of highly processed foods. That's a huge one, obviously. They also don't eat until they're stuffed. So this is that kind of caloric restriction discussion as far as how far you want to take it. This is kind of the mindful eating concept where we know we are accustomed to eating too full or eating past full. These guys really focus on eating, prior to actually being stuffed and being full. And they're huge on social connection. So when you're that old, obviously there's plenty of communities when you're retired and they have a bunch of great things going on over there. But that social connection, which we've talked about in some recent episodes, is like probably one of our missing pieces, especially right now in this busy season of life, which is why we tricked Joelle into partnering with us. So she's around us more. Um,
Gotcha.
and they also take time to de-stress. Obviously, stress is a huge factor. Shifting from sympathetic to the parasympathetic nervous system, out of that fight or flight stimulus into the rest and recovery yep
Rest
situation
and
here.
digest. Rest
Rest,
and
digest,
digest,
yes. So
parasympathetic state.
exactly. So taking that time to chill out, stress again builds up all these negative factors within our bodies, and no bueno. So those are like the main themes of what they're doing. So I don't know if you wanted to dive into some of those, if you wanted to
Yeah,
actually break these down.
I think, I think that, high level overview is helpful. They're eating a lot of plants. They're focusing on natural movement. They are focusing on putting family first. That was one of the things I read about blue zones, like very family focused, low stress, rich social interactions. But you also have to think about how many of those are interrelated, right? We've all worked with thousands of clients at this point, and we see how much, career plays a role in stress, and then how much stress plays into our ability to get a workout in, or how much stress plays into our food or like our relationship with food. Maybe we're coping with food because of the stress of work. We come home from a stressful day and like, I just want to feel better. I want that dopamine hit. I grab the ice cream instead of, whatever else. And so when you think about like family first, low stress, rich social interactions, I think so much of that, and natural movement, so much of that stems from the low stress piece. And so I don't know if these people they can't possibly be business owners or work high stress jobs. But I think that, something that we're very accustomed to here in the US is just people being very career focused and people very work focused, and that the vast majority of your day and your life is work focused. And with work often comes stress. And cost of living is high, and people are stressed about finances. And I think that stress is probably one of the biggest culprits of the health issues that we see. Um, Directly, yes, but also indirectly via we're super stressed. We might not go get that workout in. We're super stressed. We're maybe coping with food. And so I think that stress is a really big interplay. We're really stressed. Maybe we don't want to go out and see friends. I think that stress is probably the common denominator for a lot of the other things that are working well in the blue zones and that are not working well outside of those blue zones.
And that's exactly why mindset is one of our 5 pillars. So this is your foundation. When your mind is right, everything else becomes a little bit easier. You can, prioritize getting that workout, and you kind of take yourself out of that all or nothing mindset where, hey, I don't have an hour to do this in this phase of life. Can I get 20 minutes in? Can I get 30 minutes in? So we'll talk about all the time, are we doing some meditation throughout the day? Are we just focusing on mindful breathing, things we do with our kids? This
for a walk.
Going out for a walk, getting outside. So you're doubling up, you're getting that de-stress and you're getting that movement. This is the pillar that I put the cold plunge in. I know Joelle isn't huge on the cold exposure. This is what changes my life. And your brain is wired. When you get yourself to do a hard thing, you are more likely to continue to do things that you don't feel like doing. So I love the dopamine hit. It makes me feel great throughout the day. My wife can attest to I'm a different person when I'm doing this regularly. So it sets my foundation, not because, I started doing this before I started learning about any potential health benefits that are actually associated with it. This was specifically for my mindset pillar, but you could do anything. It could be gratitude journaling. It could be vocalizing to a spouse 3 things you're grateful for. You could throw 1,000 things into this bucket, but every single pillar we have is just as important in the next. And as we've kind of hit on already throughout this episode, it's not the one thing. It's the culmination of all the things that you're doing together.
And keep in mind too, I think it's really important that we highlight that you're never going to live a completely stress-free life, and you don't really want to be completely stress-free either. We need some stress. But a kind of hot topic, I know, Joelle, I think you have a post or two about this. This is like blowing up right now. I just got a DM from someone yesterday who brought up the whole cortisol thing and how her friends are telling her not to exercise because her cortisol is high and that she's too stressed out and that exercise is making it worse. So I would love for us to touch on this because I think this is also just, for some reason, it's like a trendy thing to talk about right now. It blew up on TikTok or who the heck knows where.
Like all cortisol.
Uh-oh.
We lost Joelle. Maybe. Pause.
She's out.
All face and
She's going to make me edit this episode.
Yep, she is.
my computer froze. I'm back.
There you are.
I didn't go
Okay.
anywhere. I mean, everything just kind of froze.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, guys. And I will not be editing this episode. So there's going to be a weird, it's going to be a
Josh
weird
is
10-second gap on
anti-editing.
this.
Navigating long distance podcasting. You cut out
The visual, the audio. Give us a couple weeks to figure it out, homies.
Joelle, we stopped hearing you when you said cortisol face. So repeat whatever you said after that.
I was just saying, like, I've seen the cortisol face starting to like surface. I think that was a huge thing on TikTok for a while. Yeah, it's very interesting. Exercise, we've heard for so long, like exercise is great for you, exercise is helpful for your hormones. And then you have this wave of people who are maybe experiencing some sort of hormonal dysfunction. Usually when we talk about hormone dysfunction, we're usually referring to sex hormone dysfunction. So maybe issues with estrogen levels, progesterone levels, maybe testosterone levels. And a lot of that gets associated with too much exercise. Or over exercising. And I think for most people, and this applies to the cortisol realm as well, which is where I'm tying that in. But I think that for most people, it's almost never an issue of exercise causing the issue. And in most cases, exercise is actually helping the issue. And people think it's overtraining, you're overtraining. It's usually not overtraining causing any of these issues. And it's also very, very, very hard to overtrain. It's usually under recovering that's the issue. And I know that a lot of people can feel like, oh, like that's semantics, overtraining, under recovering, same thing. It's not the same thing. Olympic athletes are training hours and hours and hours and hours every day, and they're not overtrained. They're the most elite athletes in the world, right? So it's not an overtraining situation. It's usually an under recovering situation. And I think it's really important to make that distinction, because I think for a lot of women specifically, it's usually an under eating situation where if we can't recover, it's usually not because we're training too hard. It's usually because we're not eating enough relative to how much or how intensely we're training.
Yep.
And so if we remove exercise from the picture, right? Sometimes with, let's say, high cortisol, you might see dysregulated blood sugar or increased like insulin resistance or decreased insulin sensitivity. Well, exercise is something that helps with insulin sensitivity and improves insulin sensitivity. So now if we remove exercise from your already high stress life, job, whatever, you would be making those cortisol levels worse and your blood sugar levels worse by removing exercise. So I would urge you to not exclude exercise for the sake of your cortisol, but you might need to eat. You might need to feed yourself more. You might need to improve your nutrient density. You might need to improve, your sleep quality, and your coping skills and your stress management skills. Yes, cortisol is a thing, and I don't want to, be dismissive of the fact that, like, yes, some people have very high cortisol, and some people have very low cortisol, and it is a thing. But I also think that cortisol gets a really, really bad rap. We need cortisol. Cortisol is extremely important for our health, and so I think that it's taken off in a very negative direction, and I definitely think that yeah, it's something we need, and it's now become this like evil hormone that's ruining the body, and that's usually not the case.
Yeah. And I think, just to highlight what you said about recovery, I think a lot of people think, again, the flashy things like, oh, I need to foam roll more, or I need this supplement or that magical recovery tool. It's not anything except sleep and how much you're eating. Like, those are the two main pillars of recovery. So start there and understand that those things are probably lacking if you are in a place where the other things they're just not in a good place as far as your hormones go. But there isn't ever a situation, I think, that we would say, okay, you can stop exercising completely now. And
Yeah.
that's also a common misconception. Let's say you get injured or you're sick, or, I mean, there's going to be, of course, extremes, but for most people, there's always going to be something that you can choose to do, even if it looks different than what you previously did when it comes to exercise.
There's always a way to
And
make it work. And whether it was previously 6 days and 90 minutes a day,
Right.
that was me. And now I'm down to 4 days. I can do it in 20 to 30 minutes because we're in that season of life. But it's something
yeah.
I'm still going through. I'm seeing progressive overload happen within those workouts. And I feel good, which at the bottom line, end of the day, that's what you're going for.
And that's what I was going to say too. Like, of course, we've had clients in the past who, if they're in a crazy season of life and their recovery just isn't good, right? Maybe you take like a postpartum mom or someone who's working a new job and stress is pretty high, and you are seeing in their biofeedback and check-ins that their recovery isn't great. It's not because they're overtraining, but there are other factors going into the fact that their recoverability isn't so good. And so maybe we do pull back on the way we're training or the frequency of our training or the duration of our training, but we're not going to say don't exercise, because that would do more harm than good.
1000%. So we've hit on training, we've hit on nutrition, we've hit on mindset. In regards to movement, this one can be short and sweet. There's been a lot of demonizing, I think, recently of this 10,000 step per day threshold. This is something where I feel like just across social media, people like to do extreme. So it's one side of the extreme or it's the other extreme. It's, you can have all the sugar and reach the goals, or you need to cut out all sugar or you're going to die. 99, pretty much every time, it lives in the middle somewhere. There's moderation, there's a true balance to that. I am a proponent of, I don't think you're going to obviously hurt anything by moving 10,000 steps per day. I know the ideal threshold, you get to 7,000 steps per day, and that's probably the biggest spike when it comes to return on your investment. That starts to level off, but I don't think 10,000 steps per day is a harmful number to aim for. I don't know if you have any differing thoughts on that, Joel.
No, I completely agree. I think that, 10,000 steps kind of became like the gold standard. And I don't think it's the only way. You're certainly not going to do any harm with getting 10,000 steps. When there's been some research done on like step counts and all cause mortality and things like that. And they actually found that even going from like 2,700 steps a day to I think it was like 4,400 steps a day had a 40% reduction in mortality. So I think that's where I'm big on like taking the something is better than nothing approach. And so, doing 10,000 steps, walking 10,000 steps is not going to be a detriment. But I think for some people who are so sedentary, it might feel like a really far stretch for them to hit 10,000 steps. And so if you're currently averaging 2,000 steps a day, 10,000 steps might feel really difficult. And so I think that where we started to see some of this wave of like, you don't have to hit 10,000 steps. I think that some coaches, some influencers, some accounts are just almost trying to like lower the barrier to entry. Like, okay, it doesn't have to be 10,000. Even going from 20, from 2,000 to 4,000 would be really helpful and impactful for your health. So I think that's where the 10,000 rule started to get like debunked because we live in a really sedentary, overweight country. And so I think that when we tell people, okay, at least shoot for 5,000, or 7,000, that will improve your health. It's not because 10,000 is bad or going to do any damage. It's just because I think 10,000 can feel actually really unrealistic for some people. It doesn't feel attainable for some people. So when you talk about lowering the barrier to entry to make things feel less daunting or less overwhelming for people, I think that's where people started to say like, well, actually 7,000. I think the research shows that mortality rates progressively improved and then they level off around 7,500, I think it is. But yeah, I mean, that's 25%, right? Fewer than the 10,000 step goal. And so if mortality or death is your main concern, that research shows that you could be perfectly fine reaping the benefits of 7,500 steps.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I 1,000% agree. As long as you're moving more, you're progressing in
Yeah.
that regard, it's fine. It doesn't have to go from 2 to 10, but not something that should be demonized. And then in regards to habits, and this kind of, well, let me circle back because I want to hit on something with fiber that I kind of correlate the steps. We live in this sedentary society, obviously, where most people are in that category. They're sub 4,000 steps per day. In a similar aspect, I just want to connect it to nutrition for a second. Americans average 7 grams of fiber per day. And I know we already hit on nutrition a little bit. We talked about caloric restriction, but it is very, very difficult to consume only 7 grams of fiber per day. That is
if
basically
you're eating mostly whole foods.
Well, you're not eating mostly whole
That's what I
foods.
mean.
You're not. It's
It's
just
easy
that's where it
to
is.
it's easy to hit 7 grams per day if you're eating mostly highly
If
processed
you eat a couple
foods.
raspberries and an apple, you're hitting 10 grams of fiber per day. So little things like this, seeing progress across the board, things like fiber, things like steps. It doesn't have to be perfect in any of these departments, but you do want to take a step forward and over time reach these levels that we're talking about, whether it's 7,000, whether it's 10,000 steps per day, whether it's 30, 40 grams of fiber per day. Little things like that are going to make an unbelievable difference in your overall health. So circling back to habits, habits are the tiny little things we can do on a daily basis that lead to the dramatic transformation over time. We talked about this stuff a couple episodes ago, but essentially, if you have a specific goal, taking a mini version of that and making that the habit. So the one I always circle back to is if your goal is reading a book per month, reading 2 pages per night before bed, because it's very minimal. You can always check that box. You're usually going to go above and beyond that. But again, reducing that barrier to entry, it's never going to feel overwhelming, no matter how tired or how little time you have. So just setting up a stack of habits related to something that you want to achieve, whether it's career wise, whether it's personal development, whether it's your health and fitness, making sure we have these things built in. We talk about these pillars ebbing and flowing into each other. We can call every single one of these the foundation, but you can essentially build your 5 pillars of health with a habit for each to make sure that you are flowing through and checking all these boxes. So I don't know if you guys have your top 3 habits you would recommend semi-universally. Obviously, there's no one size fits all, but things that you think would be great for someone who wants to take something from this episode today. Your top 3.
Morning water was mine. That's been my poll on Instagram for, well, now it's different, but Start your day with a glass of water. Keep it by your bed, your nightstand. Keep it super easy to just roll over, grab it before you do anything else. I think that alone can be something that sort of bleeds into the rest of the day. I also like the reading one. That for me is like my wind down routine at night. I don't read a number of pages before bed, but I read for a chunk of time, like at least 10 minutes. Usually it's a lot longer than that, and that knocks me right out. Could be pregnancy related, could not be. My third one is just getting up and going for a walk a few times a day, 10-minute walk. Get your butt up from your desk chair and get outside, which as a business owner, surprisingly, that is hard for us. We are fitness trainers, fitness people, but our jobs are very sedentary. So taking the
Yeah.
time to set aside 5 to 10 minutes in the middle of my day it makes such a difference on the days that I do it.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the walk one. I think that even if it's a 5 minute walk, and specifically outside if possible, personally, I feel like that makes a big difference. If I go into my basement and walk on the treadmill for 10 minutes, I do not feel the same as if I got outside, got fresh air on my face, some sunshine on my face, and walked outside for 5 or 10 minutes. That always I always get, obviously that's physically healthy, but I mentally feel so much better when I get outside for a few minutes to take a walk. And usually, even if I tell myself like just 5 minutes, like I got to get back to work, just 5 minutes, it ends up being a 10-minute walk or a 20-minute walk or whatever. Cause you're like, this feels kind of nice. I'm just going to keep walking for a little bit longer.
Mhm.
Kind of like how you said with the book, Josh, like you're probably going to go longer than that, or also, Sanja, you'll probably go longer than those 10 minutes. Um, so the walk one is big for me. Another habit that I really like to encourage is just a color with every meal. And for a lot of people, I think that sounds a lot less daunting for some reason than telling people like you got to eat more fruits and vegetables. You got to eat more fruits and vegetables. That's not an actionable step. But when you tell someone, hey, try to get in a color with every meal that you have, and that color could be a fruit or a vegetable, that's a great habit to start including. So a fruit or a vegetable with a meal, but when we call it color, it just seems a little bit more fun, a little bit less daunting. We tell people, try to shoot for a minimum of 3 colors per day. And so that also helps with nutrient diversity because if you're only ever eating like broccoli and green beans and peas, those are all green. So you still only had one color, even though that is maybe 3 different vegetables. I'm not going to tell you not to do that, but I'm just saying that's not a ton of color diversity. Different colors, have different nutrients and do different things for the body. So I like to tell people color with every meal, try to shoot for a minimum of 3 colors, either fruit or vegetable. Um, and a third one, I'm just gonna go with sleep. And I know that that's tough because depending on the season of life, and I mostly think of like postpartum moms for this one. Like if you got a baby who's not sleeping through the night, or you're up multiple times in the middle of the night with a newborn, like yeah, you're in a shit season. You're in a shit sleep season right now. But it won't stay that way forever. And I also think that on that note, and this could probably be a whole different topic, Alessandra, I know you and I both get asked about like sleep training a ton. And, I think that both of our families do things in a way that helps our children, yes, but also helps us as parents and as spouses with, our significant others that helps balance things out. And so what I mean by that is, having a 7 o'clock bedtime for our kids. And then now you have spouse time post bedtime. And I understand like our kids are little, they're not going to be 15 years old and have 7 p.m. bedtimes.
The hell
But
they're
like
not.
right now we're in a season of life where like I have friends who have babies the same age and they put their kids down at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And I'm like, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't have spouse time. Wouldn't have that wind down time. And I think that sleep training was a part of that too. Like our sleep is really important to us and it plays a role in how we show up in work, in how we show up in our training, how we show up in feeding ourselves and our hunger and satiety. And so it was important to us from early on that our kids were sleeping pretty well because it meant we could sleep well, which meant we could be better parents and we could show up and exercise. And so, yeah, I'm going to go with the sleep thing. Again, I know that's a little bit hard if you're hearing this and you're kind of in the postpartum haze. But other than that, and maybe being like a night shift worker, other than that, you have very few reasons that you should not be getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night.
And listen, even if you are in that harder stage, where you can't control how many times you're woken up throughout the night. There is so much you can do before you even get to sleep to improve your sleep hygiene, right? We've talked about this countless times again here on the podcast, but just having that wind down routine, not just binging 50 episodes of Netflix before bed and expecting yourself to get tired from that. Making sure, I know this is helpful for you specifically, Josh, but it's something that I have also found helpful as we try to eat dinner a little bit or as early as we possibly can and stop eating for a certain chunk of time before bedtime. Again, depends on your season of life, but there are things you can do to set yourself up for as good of a night's sleep as you possibly can that is in your control. And if you get woken up, that's outside of your control, but at least you did what you had to do to get to sleep
Right.
at a decent hour.
So I'll hit on that for a quick second. The 3 hour rule for me was really for Barrett's esophagus and making sure
Very
nothing's
good.
coming back up. But it has been proven if you are shutting down food 3 hours before bed, you could do this tonight. Like if your schedule allows for it, your sleep will improve tremendously because then your body isn't digesting for the first 6 hours of your sleep. It's actually resting, it's actually replenishing those tissues and you're rejuvenating your body. So there are actual benefits beyond like what I'm dealing with, the symptoms for that. As far as going through those proper sleep cycles, it is an absolute game changer. If you suck at falling asleep, you lay in bed staring at the ceiling or whatever the deal is. If you shut down dinner a bit earlier, it will make a world of a difference, and you can do it tonight. And then my three, I've got a whole bunch, but three that are kind of different. What you guys were talking about: journal every morning. I wake up, I do my journal before I dive into work, before the kids get up. Um, I already forgot the other two
Write a
immediately.
love note on Alessandra's mirror.
That's in. It's not a daily habit. Like when I get a nice, little jolt of inspiration that goes on the mirror.
Do
Sometimes
you ask
stuck with the
ChatGPT
same
for those?
message.
What's that?
I said, do you ask ChatGPT for some ideas on
Everything. My
those?
brain doesn't work anymore. It's all chat GPT. What's a sweet note for my wife today? Okay, so the journal, that was one. Meditation, I do that before bed. So I'll meditate and then I'll read the book. So that would be my third is the 2 pages, but it's usually, closer to 10 or so, and then I'm out like a light. So journal, 10-minute meditation, read my book. Those are three that I really enjoy, and those are basically non-negotiables. I don't skip those ever. All right, guys.
Cold plunge.
I mean, I do that. That change, like a habit is something I say I schedule like a doctor's appointment. So, like if I'm training first thing in the morning, like I'll wake up, do a little bit of work, and then work out. Like I'm not cold plunging that morning because you need at least an 8 hour buffer. So if I work out early, I'm not doing it that day, and I'll go a little bit longer the next morning. So I do it. It's in my routine. I don't call that a habit because I do. I
It's
am
not a
very
daily thing.
religious with habits.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right. And then, Joel, you're new, but something we talk about at the end of these episodes is we do have a 3 episode rule. Listen to up to three. If you're continuing to listen, if you're getting value from these episodes, we just ask that you please leave us a quick 5-star review. If you want to write a little blurb on there, that's awesome. Tag us, share us on social media. That's how this audience grows. Our goal here is to create change. So through awareness, we create change. We're bringing you guys tools. These are free, actionable steps you guys can take to make your lives better, to improve the lives of your families. And again, we're not charging for this. If you can just help us, if this helped you, it's probably going to help somebody else. So that's your role in this community. That's all that we ask is you share this so that somebody else can get a benefit from that. Where can they find you? I'm pointing at the computer.
You could find me at Joelle Samantha on Instagram.
We're going to find you.
At Alessandra Skutnik.
I'm at Josh Skutnik.
And everything else you need link wise is linked in the show notes.